If you want to know how much money you need to retire and never work another day in your life, the answer is pretty simple. About 25 times your annual expenses. If you typically spend $40K in a year, you need somewhere around $1 million invested to maintain that lifestyle forever without working. If you enjoy the simpler things in life and can be happy on only $20K a year, then you only need about $500,000 to retire. Best of all, depending on your savings rate, you can actually reach this amount of money in a very short amount of time. When most people first hear of this, they're usually a little bit skeptical and they rightfully have a whole bunch of follow-up questions. I've been answering those same questions over and over for years now, which is something I weirdly enjoy doing, so here they all are in one place. The first thing most people want to know is why 25 times my annual expenses? Like, if I'm young, I should have to save more, and if I'm old, I probably need to save a little less since I don't need to plan for as many years ahead of me, right? The answer, surprisingly, is not really. This 25 times your expenses number, also called your FIRE number or your Financial Independence Retire Early number, comes from something called the 4% rule. Here's the basic idea. The 25 years of expenses you've saved up isn't just going to sit in a bank account somewhere. For this to work, it has to be invested in such a way that it earns at least a 4% real return on average over the course of your lifetime. We'll talk about how you actually get that 4% return in a minute, but just stay with me for right now. If you have 25 years expenses and investments, and those investments produce a 4% return each year, that means they're producing 1 year's worth of expenses every year, which by design is exactly how much you need to live on. So as you withdraw from your portfolio each year, it grows by enough to make up for that withdrawal, and on average, it never depletes. Sounds nice, but I know, you still have questions. The next thing on your mind is probably, wait, just because I can live on $40K a year right now, doesn't mean I can live on $40K in the year 2050. Inflation is going to eat this plan alive. Well, I have good news for you. The 4% rule already accounts for inflation. The 4% return we're talking about is a real return. And a real return means that it's the return in excess of the rate of inflation. So with this plan, you can give yourself a little raise equal to inflation each year during retirement, and your portfolio should be able to keep up. For example, if you withdrew $40K from your $1 million portfolio during your first year of retirement, that's 4%, and then inflation was 3% that year, then you could safely withdraw $41,200 the next year, and so on to keep up with inflation every year thereafter. Now, let's talk about where that 4% real investment return actually comes from. The 4% rule usually assumes that you're putting your money into passive stock market and bond market index funds. These funds are really easy. You can buy them with just a few clicks through any brokerage account, and they're just set it and forget it investments. They're not a second job. What they're designed to do is track the average performance of the broad stock and bond markets over time automatically. The 4% rule kind of loosely assumes that your early retiree is going to invest at least half of their portfolio into riskier stock market index funds, with whatever's left over invested into safer bond market index funds. Historically, the stock market has returned somewhere around 10 or 11% per year over the long run, and bonds have returned closer to 5 or 6%. If you average these together, you get an expected average return of about 8% per year. But remember, we need to look at real return, so we need to subtract inflation from that. Inflation has averaged somewhere around 3% per year over the long run, leaving us with an expected real return of about 5% per year. But remember, that return isn't guaranteed, it's just an average. So to give ourselves a little margin of safety, we're going to aim for a 4% withdrawal rate, and there you have it. That's where the 4% rule comes from. Okay, not really, but that's a pretty convincing oversimplification, right? In reality, a lot of research has been done to arrive at that 4% recommended number, starting with something called the Trinity study, which you can Google later if you want to. But honestly, the 4% rule isn't carved in stone. It's just a guideline based on history, and I personally think it's a reasonably safe one. Some people are even more aggressive, and they actually assume the full 5% real return. If you do that, you can retire with only 20 times your annual expenses saved, but there's a little bit more risk of failure. Some other people are more conservative, and they assume a 3.3% rule, which means they have to save up 30 times their annual expenses to retire, but it's a little bit safer and there's less chance of failure. Anyway, somewhere around 4% is generally accepted as reasonable. You might be thinking right about now, okay, all this sounds pretty good in theory, but how do I actually get my money out once I'm retired? Like, I'm looking at some of these index funds online, and the dividend payments that they throw off are often way less than 4%. So wouldn't that mean I have to sell shares every year during my retirement to fund my lifestyle? The answer is yes. You will absolutely have to sell a tiny bit of your investment portfolio every year to live on. But no, that does not mean you will eventually run out of money. See, you're withdrawing money at a slow enough rate that the remaining money grows enough to make up for that withdrawal before the next one, on average at least. The bottom line here is you really can sell shares every year forever and still never run out of shares. That doesn't sound like it should be possible, but if you've ever taken a calculus course, here's some proof that it is. Now, the next objection you might raise is that I've been making a whole lot of assumptions here that might not be true all the time. Like, most bonds absolutely did not pay 5% interest in 2021, and the stock market did not return 10% in 2022. It actually dropped something like 20%, and inflation wasn't a tame 3% that year either. You're absolutely right. Someone who was strictly using the 4% rule during 2022, for example, would have been continuing to make withdrawals from a beat-up portfolio. And there's tons more examples back in history that can show you the same thing. But remember, the 4% rule is based on historical data in the first place. And the vast majority of time, it's done completely fine even through those rough patches. That's because extra good years tend to make up for extra bad years on average over a long enough time horizon. With that said, this is also why you can't be greedy when you're using the 4% rule. If you have an extra good year of plus 30% in the stock market, you just continue to make your normal 4% rule withdrawal anyway, because you might need that padding in the future to make up for a really bad year. It's all part of the plan. Another thing you might be thinking about is how you're even legally able to access your investment portfolio during an early retirement. Like, in the US, you're only supposed to be able to access your 401k and your IRA when you're like 60 years old. So how does that work? Well, there's a few things to consider here. First of all, if you're saving money fast enough to retire by 30 or 40, you're probably exceeding the contribution limits on your 401k and your IRA anyway. That means you're forced to use a taxable brokerage account, which has absolutely no withdrawal restrictions. So when you retire, you can just tap that first, and hopefully it lasts you long enough until you can tap your age-restricted accounts. If not, there are other loopholes too, like tapping Roth IRA contributions, which can be accessed anytime, or using something called a Roth conversion ladder, or using another IRS rule known as substantially equal periodic payments. I'm not going to get into the details of all these in this video, but give them a Google later if you're curious. Now, since I mentioned that you might be using a taxable brokerage account for a lot of your investing, you might have thought of another problem: taxes. In our original assumptions, we accounted for inflation, but we never even talked about taxes at all. In fact, the 4% rule assumes that you're going to pay 0 taxes on your investments during retirement. That's because in the US, you can actually engineer your taxes to be very close to 0 when you're living off an investment portfolio. Qualified Roth IRA withdrawals are naturally tax-free, and as for the money in your taxable brokerage account, most of the gains are probably going to be something called long-term capital gains, which have their own special tax bracket. And guess what? That tax bracket is 0% for incomes up to $44,625 in 2023. So a tax-free, or at least a very low-tax early retirement isn't just a pipe dream. It's actually really doable. Hopefully I answered all your questions about the 4% rule, and now would be a great time to press the like button and subscribe for more. But before you go, I did want to mention one more thing, and it's pretty important. If I'm really being honest, the 4% rule is kind of BS. And as an early retiree myself, I actually have no intention of following it. Here's why. If you retire when you're 30 or 40 or even 50 years old, you're probably not going to make 0 money for the rest of your life. You might not want to work 40 hours a week anymore. I mean, I certainly don't. but maintaining some level of productivity is actually usually fun for most people. You might start a business you've always dreamed of, or just turn your hobby into a fun side gig. Like, I still do photography and a bit of physics tutoring because I actually like those things, and they continue to make me richer. In fact, not only am I not withdrawing my 4% per year right now, I'm withdrawing nothing because my little side hustles still produce enough income to pay for all of my living expenses. Don't be surprised if you end up in the same boat. For me, the 4% rule was just a guideline that gave me the confidence I needed to quit my job and eventually the option to be able to never work again as long as I live. To see how my wife and I achieved that together and what we're actually up to now, check out our blog at tripofalifestyle.com. If you like this kind of stuff, don't forget to subscribe or follow along on your favorite social media platform.